Good evening. This is a talk about the future of US foreign policy and geopolitics. The grand strategy of the US after the disasters in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other parts of Middle East and North Africa, including Libya, would seem to call for some reassessment and change. And the same kind of thing, although it has been less disastrous with respect to China, and to the extent Russia is also an Asian power. Russia, East Asia, and also South Asia, I think call for deep reflection about U.S. grand strategy since the end of the Cold War. And the unipolar moment that really already has passed should give us some pause. So I argue in this talk that the US should change its grand strategy, giving up hegemonic practices and working multilaterally with other nations, particularly the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, in order to achieve the twin related goals of global peace and economic prosperity. US policy towards Asia is much more than mere regional policy. As the largest continent on our planet, to a large extent, Asia holds the key towards the global future, for better or for worse. US relations with Asia are therefore crucial for any reasonable assessment of various pathways to the future. It is my hope that wise reciprocal or even wise unilateral US policies will open the door towards a better planetary future. Part of this changed strategy will be to build the institutions for a hybrid global financial architecture where regional financial architectures will play a crucial role for averting financial and economic crises. To this end, cooperating with East Asia in particular is of great strategic significance. What really has happened after the end of Cold War? The end of the Cold War led to what some have called the unipolar moment. US interventions in Asia and elsewhere since the end of Cold War have led some prominent scholars in international relations and security studies to question the US grand strategy. For example, referring to US interventions in this period, Professor Christopher Lane remarks thoughtfully, and I quote, "Few raised their eyebrows about Panama 1989 or Haiti 1994-2004. After all, the United States has a track record of wielding a big stick to maintain stability in its own backyard. But the two wars with Iraq, 1991-2003, the US military interventions in the Balkans, Bosnia in 1995, Kosovo in 1999, and the invasion of Afghanistan, 2001, do stand out. The first war with Iraq was fought to exert US geopolitical primacy in the Gulf. The Balkan interventions aimed to strengthen Washington's control of NATO, the major institution for maintaining US influence in European affairs, and to project American power into the East Mediterranean region where it could link up with a growing US military presence in the Middle East. As an aside, I could say here that NATO did very little, actually, during the time of Cold War, when supposedly the whole world was under threat of nuclear warfare with USSR. And both superpowers were armed to the teeth. Now we have a very weak Russia and China that really doesn't want to challenge any hegemon, is just happy doing business. All of a sudden we have a much more strengthened NATO. And only recently, I talked with an Italian strategic thinker who used to be a top general in the Italian Air Force, Enzo Camporini, and Enzo told me over a cup of coffee that he was writing an op-ed for a Polish paper, basically asking the Polish to be much more cautious about Ukraine and not stir up trouble in Russia's own backyard. The advice actually seemed too good to be heeded by the current leaders of Poland. I never quite found out whether the Poles even ever published what this very thoughtful Italian ex-general described to me. So both on the European side and on the American side, there's a great deal of self-inflating rhetoric about NATO that has led NATO to become a much more adventurous organization, indeed a threat to regional peace, if not world peace, right now. So this whole NATO strategy of the US will need to be rethought, but I'm not sure that the present president or any future president anytime soon will actually want to pick up the challenge of rethinking about NATO. Well, Lane goes on with Afghanistan. He says, Afghanistan allowed the United States to do more than go after Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. The United States shored up its strategic position in the Middle East while simultaneously extending its reach into Central Asia and in the process challenging Russia's influence in Moscow's own backyard. He goes on to add, had the Cold War not ended, it is doubtful that the United States would have fought these wars. Why did the Cold Wars end lead to a new wave of US expansion? That's easy. After the Soviet collapse, the United States stood head and shoulders above the rest of the world, militarily and economically. The United States, moreover, was imbued with an expansive conception of its world role and its interests. By removing the only real check on US power, the Soviet Union's demise presented the United States with the opportunity to use its capabilities to exert more control over, to, quote, shape, unquote, the international political system and simultaneously to increase its power. When the risks of doing so appear low and the potential rewards appear high, states with lots of power usually succumb to the temptation to use it. In the years since the Cold War, the United States has extended its strategic reach because it had the motive, means, and opportunity to do so. This is from his book, The Peace of Illusions, which was published from Cornell University Press in 2006. Since 2006, a lot of things have happened, especially the crisis in Ukraine, which is also in Russia's backyard, or maybe front yard, and of course in the Middle East. The most positive thing has been the nuclear negotiations between Iran and US, for which both the foreign minister of Iran, who I'm very proud to say is a PhD from our school, and our own Secretary of State, John Kerry, are to be given much credit. And of course, all the people who worked with them preparing the technical position papers and reviews. It was very hard work, and I think the diplomats on both sides, as well as the technical support personnel on both sides, deserve a lot of credit for effecting this great diplomatic démarche, as the French would call it. The future is yet uncertain because in both Iran and in the United States there is tremendous opposition internally also to this kind of what to us would seem to be very rational progress in the relations between these two countries. But the very same set of events that led to a lowering of tensions between Iran and the US led to a heightening of tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Turkey is a somewhat different case, and I will come to that shortly. But Saudi Arabia has intensified its support of terrorist organizations all over the world, but especially in Syria, and it has intervened militarily in Yemen. Ironically, it has shown that Saudi Arabia's own military is not much of a fighting force, and they have to rely permanently, perhaps, on the US, and now there is some doubt in Riyadh about how reliable an ally the US will be over the long run. Of course, if American people think rationally and put enough pressure, as well as American policymakers who have been not so rational so far on the whole with respect to Middle East, suddenly become more rational, then indeed there is great danger for despotic rulers in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere in the Middle East. But that future is very uncertain. Some people, I think quite foolishly, have tried to egg on Obama and American foreign policymakers to a military intervention in Syria. I think quite wisely, Obama avoided that. A lot of false statistics have been manufactured in the worst possible way. I was witness to one such presentation in our own school just recently. I am quite shocked that academics who supposedly know the region and know the events unfolding in Syria actually tacitly or explicitly support such abuse of statistical data and such crude propaganda. This is the type of move that we have seen many times in the past, disseminating disinformation, preparing public opinion in the worst possible sense for foreign intervention, and putting American lives at risk and increasing the dangers of terrorism even further. So on all practical, consequential reasoning, taking into account the facts on the ground, one of which is that there is no reasonable moderate opposition on ground in Syria. There may be such people outside Syria, but there are very few in Syria fighting or willing to fight. So it doesn't make any sort of political or military sense from the US point of view. And so far, US foreign policy has been at least wise to the extent that we have avoided direct military intervention there. All that might change after the 2016 elections. So American people have actually their work cut out for them in this respect. The Middle East is still a dangerous keg of potentially explosive powder, ready to explode at a moment's notice. And here, I should focus on Turkey and its recent adventurist games. Essentially, Turkey has been bribed by the EU in exchange for $3 billion. EU hopes that it will not get as many refugees as it was getting, which of course may only be a pious hope. We shall see what happens. In the meantime, Turkey has probably one of the most repressive regimes in the history of the Turkish Republic since the end of the Second World War, and its progressive policies that were instituted since the Kemalist regime, they are under threat, as well as the public opening of dissent, the negotiations with PKK, the Kurdish party that is quite moderate, or was quite moderate until recently. All these things bode very ill for Turkey. The Turkish party in power, AKP, is not really fundamentally an Islamic party, although it uses Islam as rhetoric. It represents basically the rising bourgeoisie from the interior, who were very small or at best middle type of businessmen before, but with the benefit of their own regime, for over a decade. Now they are in much stronger position, and they have made an alliance with the bigger bourgeoisie in Turkey. Now Turkey, although I think calling them neo-Ottomans is going too far, has become a much more aggressive country with respect to the Middle East. Syria, in effect, is now a rump state, practically divided. The Kurds have more autonomy than ever before, and nobody would begrudge the Kurds finally having a bit of autonomy south of the border from Turkey, but that of course has irked Turkey to no end, and Turkey is quite willing to actually militarily intervene and put out the light of freedom in that area of liberated Kurdistan. World public opinion will be against Turkey, but it has never stopped despotic, aggressive governments in the world before. So Turkey is indeed playing a very dangerous, destabilizing game. Israel has been quiet because all these moves essentially ensure Israel's position militarily and politically in the region. In the meantime, Palestinians are being meted out a great deal of punishment. A lot of new settlements are going up, and Palestinians fare even worse than they did before, which was not a very good state of affairs to begin with. So Palestinians are really one of the least fortunate people in the world today, I would say. And unfortunately, the problems in Middle East with rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran and Turkey and Israel on the side there, I don't see much scope for improvement of Palestinian people's lot. US has really lost all credibility in terms of being a disinterested, honest broker. Perhaps US can still regain that position by making a number of confidence-building moves in the next 2 years or so, but we'll have to wait and see if those moves are indeed going to be made. Just briefly, in South Asia, US is looking for an alliance with India, and current right-wing regime in India is quite willing to exploit that, although their main target still remains Pakistan and dismemberment of Pakistan, as well as founding a country on the ideology of Hindu Brahmanic chauvinism. I don't think they will succeed because there will be a lot of internal opposition from India itself to this project. But Indo-American alliance, which will be opportunistic to say the least on both sides, is a possibility and will further destabilize both India's relationships with China, which is a leading trade partner, and East Asia in general. So let me just wrap it up by making a few comments with regards to China, East Asia, and Russia vis-a-vis the United States. In geopolitical terms, China and Russia both are very big countries, both have very strong military, strong enough to defend their territories and territories that might matter to them nearby. This much I think US military strategists certainly understand, although politicians may not. Certainly their public statements don't give anyone any kind of sense of security. But it would be really foolish, if not suicidal, to confront China and Russia together or separately, because both are nuclear powers and both have enough economic and political and military clout to face down United States and Europe. Europeans already realize this, especially Germany. Germany has become much milder with respect to Russia. It is much more interested in mutual dialogue and solving problems, especially economic problems that could lead to mutual benefit separately. France probably will fall in line as well. And Italy, of course, has a lot of internal problems, but Italy will probably go along. If the so-called New Europe of Bush, Poland in particular, remains intransigent, that is not going to help either NATO or the hawks in the US very much. This is the realistic way of looking at Russia, I believe. Clear the lens of ideology, the foggy lens of ideology and prejudice and misinformation, and think rationally and with a cool head. China is an economic superpower. China may have a lot of internal problems. It is definitely true that there are problems of nationalities, problems of Muslim militants, problems of income disparity, floating workers, problems of looming environmental disaster even, and of course problems between China and Japan, and China and Southeast Asian countries. But one thing that is certain, people who know China, who have been there, who talk with China, who have read Chinese history, and who understand the Chinese establishment mindset as well as the mindset of ordinary Chinese people, would tell you that one thing that is certain about China is that Chinese will never allow themselves to be dominated by any foreign power, whether it is Japan or Russia or US or Europe. That is a constant factor in Chinese consciousness and Chinese politics across the spectrum. China is a country with high degree of inequality today. China has developed a ruling class, which is a complex one because even within the Communist Party, there are still people, after decades of capitalist-like development and widening of income and wealth disparities, who believe that China should be a more egalitarian country and China should serve the needs of ordinary people. They may not prevail, which is definitely a distinct possibility given the dynamics of class relations in China. But China is a much more complex country than the so-called China experts in the West think it is. So in many ways, American people are being sold a false bill of goods on Middle East, on China, on Russia, under the name of so-called regional experts. That is a shame and a disgrace, I must say. Many of these experts don't even know the language of their region, and they certainly don't know the history in enough detail about these histories, about these regions. And they have tremendous ideological baggages that they carry with them. There are, of course, objective, independent scholars, but recent political trends in the US suggest that they really don't get the platform. People like Stephen Cohen, undoubtedly one of the greatest experts on Russian history, hardly has a platform to speak from. On the contrary, the neoconservatives who know very little about even their own country, let alone the rest of the world, and carry this very simple black and white ideological baggage with a great deal of illusion about what American military power can do in the world, get all kinds of platforms and have all kinds of political and financial support, and left to their own devices, they will definitely carry this country down the primrose path of disaster, and with this country, the rest of the world. So with this caution, this warning, I will end this talk. Thank you.